On January 5, 1942, as triumphant cries echoed through Tokyo, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto directed the Imperial Combined Fleet to prepare for the next stage of the Pacific War. Reports from the Philippines, Malaya, and beyond suggested that within months Japan would dominate East Asia. He ordered his Chief of Staff, Admiral Mato Mugaki, to have new plans ready by mid-February. Japan's lightning victories astonished even its own planners and ignited fierce debates in Tokyo. Nationalist hardliners pushed for endless expansion. Yamamoto, however, remained cautious. He had opposed war with the United States and Britain from the start, fearing Japan could not win a long struggle. His doubts were so well known that friends feared for his life. He lived aboard the battleship Yamato to avoid assassination. Mugaki's diary echoed Yamamoto's warnings. Japan's success demanded far-sighted statesmanship, not reckless conquest. Months before Pearl Harbor, Yamamoto had warned nationalist leader Ryoichi Sasakawa that Japan would spread like an octopus at first, but the euphoria would not last. True victory, he said, required political action once Singapore fell. Until then, Japan's leaders risked mistaking short-term triumphs for lasting security. Yamamoto knew the West well. He had studied in America, served as naval attaché in Washington, and represented Japan at London's naval conferences. His judgment was clear: Japan had perhaps 18 months of glory, after which it must secure peace. He confided this to Sasakawa, urging him to carry the message to Japan's right-wing politicians. By early January, the victories seemed unstoppable. The U.S. battleship fleet lay crippled at Pearl Harbor. British warships Repulse and Prince of Wales had been sunk. Hong Kong had fallen, Manila was captured, and Japan's forces surged into the Indies and Solomons. Yet the American aircraft carriers, absent at Pearl Harbor, remained untouched, and Yamamoto knew they posed a mortal threat. What Japan needed now, he believed, was a decisive blow so spectacular that it might force the West to negotiate. The fall of Singapore would help, but it would not be enough. He proposed striking the Soviet Union, but the army, bogged down in China, refused. He then urged an offensive into the Indian Ocean to smash the British fleet and link with German advances in the Middle East. Again, the army resisted. That left two options. Some Tokyo strategists pushed for an invasion of Australia, followed by sweeping control of New Guinea, Fiji, and Samoa. Yamamoto rejected it as too slow and insufficiently dramatic. He wanted something bold, something that would stun America into compromise. By March, he had his answer. He drafted the MI plan: lure the U.S. carriers into battle at Midway and annihilate them. Alongside it, the AL plan called for invading Alaska's Aleutians, paving the way for possible moves on Hawaii, or even the American West Coast. Only such victories, Yamamoto believed, could give Japan the leverage to offer a so-called olive branch. But in Tokyo's ministries, admirals argued bitterly over the future. Japan's war path was set on a razor's edge, between breathtaking triumph and looming disaster. In the end, Yamamoto prevailed. Forgotten were the possible political uses of Singapore's fall in February or the collapse of Bataan and Corregidor soon after, events that might have advanced his strategy. Their significance vanished with one stunning blow: Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle's daring raid on Tokyo in April. 16 B-25 bombers struck the Japanese capital, a symbolic attack that did little material damage but shook the nation to its core. For the first time, Japan realized the Americans were not defeated, they were only beginning to fight. 2 months later, Yamamoto's grand gamble at Midway unraveled in catastrophe. 4 of Japan's fleet carriers were lost in a single battle. Yet the scale of the disaster was carefully hidden. Outside the highest levels of the Navy, even the Army remained unaware. Official reports painted Midway as a victory, while Yamamoto's combined fleet limped back from its failed, decisive battle. Meanwhile, the Japanese advance pressed southward. Rabaul had fallen in January, and from that stronghold Japan launched constant air attacks across New Guinea and the Solomons. Australia, already shaken by the bombing of Darwin in February, watched with dread. General Douglas MacArthur, newly arrived after his escape from the Philippines in March, warned Canberra that Japan's next move would strike New Guinea, and from there, northern Australia itself was within reach. In March, Japanese forces landed at Salamaua, New Guinea, accelerating their push. In May, they aimed at Port Moresby, but were stopped in the fierce carrier clash of the Coral Sea, the first battle in history where opposing fleets never saw each other, fighting entirely with aircraft. The Japanese seized Tulagi in the Solomons and built a seaplane base, but their momentum had slowed. The Coral Sea convinced leaders in Washington and Australia that Japan's next thrust southward was imminent. MacArthur pressed Washington for reinforcements, 2 carriers, 1,000 planes, and an amphibious division. But in May, Admiral Ernest J. King, Chief of Naval Operations, bluntly informed General George C. Marshall that only 2 U.S. carriers remained operational in the Pacific, while Yamamoto prepared for Midway with 10. Even as Midway unfolded, the Japanese army pursued its own southern strategy. General Tomitaro Horii's South Seas Force occupied La and advanced across New Guinea, while Lieutenant General Harakichi Hyakutake prepared to push further, toward New Caledonia, Fiji, and Samoa. These moves were planned independently of Yamamoto, who was expected to return victorious from Midway to shield the advance with his carrier fleet. Instead, Japan's naval power was shattered. Yet the truth of Midway's disaster never reached the field commanders, and Imperial General Headquarters pressed ahead as if nothing had changed. Australia soon warned MacArthur that Japanese forces were ready to move again. He proposed striking preemptively at Rabaul, Japan's key air and naval base, with massive Allied force. Marshall offered the plan to Admiral King, 3 carriers, 1 Marine division, and 3 Army divisions. King opposed it. He would not place MacArthur in command, and he feared heavy carrier losses to land-based air. Instead, he drafted his own plan, an island-hopping drive through the Solomons, beginning with Guadalcanal. MacArthur objected to Army troops serving under Navy control, but the Joint Chiefs sided with King. Guadalcanal was barely a dot on the map, thought to hold little value, but it lay directly in the path of Japan's advance. King's plan would require fewer resources, and crucially, American forces were already training nearby in New Caledonia. Reinforcements were flowing into Samoa and the New Hebrides, while new bases were planned at Tonga. The stage was set. As the echoes of Midway faded, a new battlefront was forming in the Solomons, one that would decide whether Japan's drive toward Australia would continue, or be broken on a jungle-covered island few Americans had ever heard of, Guadalcanal. The Allied response to Japan's southern drive took shape in stages. First, amphibious forces would be trained in the South Pacific. Then, a combined offensive by the United States, Australia, and New Zealand would push through the Solomons to the Bismarck Archipelago and the Admiralties. A third stage would seize the Caroline and Marshall Islands. Finally, the Allies would strike either the Dutch East Indies or the Philippines. Admiral Ernest J. King approved. It was exactly the kind of plan he envisioned. To carry it out, he recalled Vice Admiral Robert L. Gormley from London to command the South Pacific. Rear Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner was pulled from the planning division to prepare for amphibious operations. All of this was set in motion even before Japan's assaults on Port Moresby and Tulagi. When Turner arrived at Pearl Harbor that same day, Nimitz showed him the report. The target was clear, Guadalcanal. Within 2 weeks, Turner was in Wellington aboard his flagship, the Macaulay, tasked with training an amphibious force in just 1 month. Gormley, meanwhile, met with General Douglas MacArthur in Melbourne. Both men doubted the plan. With limited aircraft, they warned, there could be no guarantee of air cover. On July 18, they sent a dispatch recommending delay. King's reply was blunt, no postponements. The invasion would proceed. Gormley had already doubted America's readiness for bold action. His worries deepened when he failed to secure construction units or additional reinforcements. From the beginning, intelligence and logistics were plagued with errors. Allied reports underestimated the Japanese airfield at Guadalcanal, some even placed it on the wrong side of the island. Meanwhile, in Japan, Yamamoto ordered a major operation from Rabaul to begin August 14, with Guadalcanal as its centerpiece. Gormley begged for more help, planes, bases, anything to strengthen his hand. But King's warning proved true, the tools would not arrive until later. Even supply loading was chaotic. Transports were packed haphazardly in California, then shipped to Noumea, where no facilities existed to reorganize them. But time was running out. King knew Australia must be protected, and there could be no delay. By late July, the race was on. Troopships carrying 17,000 Marines surged across the Pacific from California, Pearl Harbor, Noumea, and Samoa. On July 28, Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher gathered commanders aboard the carrier Saratoga. Fletcher would protect the invasion with his carrier task force. Turner would land Major General Alexander Vandegrift's Marines. Once Guadalcanal was secured, garrison troops would follow. But the haste of the operation was obvious. No reserve forces were available. The Allies were about to launch their first major offensive in the Pacific with no margin for error. The meeting aboard the Saratoga on July 28 was tense. Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher opened by announcing that he would keep his carriers over the Guadalcanal landings for only 2 days. After that, he would withdraw. His staff agreed, the carriers must not be risked. Fletcher, already known for his caution, believed the entire operation was rushed, reckless, and likely doomed. Rear Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner bristled. More than anyone else in the room, Turner grasped the global stakes. He told his superior bluntly that the decision had been made, the landings would go forward, no matter the risks. Their duty was to carry out orders, not question them. Fletcher, however, remained wary. His reluctance had already frustrated Admiral King, who doubted Fletcher's aggressiveness even after Midway. Now, on the eve of America's first offensive in the Pacific, Fletcher's warning that he would desert the landing force in 48 hours cast a shadow over the entire operation. The rehearsal that followed on Coral Island in Fiji did little to inspire confidence. Only a third of the Marines managed to get ashore, and those who did were left milling about without clear direction. General Alexander Vandegrift judged the exercise a complete failure. But there was no time to fix mistakes. By July 31, the Marines were back aboard their transports, heading for Guadalcanal. On August 6, as the task force of 75 ships approached the Solomons, Fletcher peeled his carriers away, promising air cover but keeping his 26 ships well clear of danger. The irony was stark. American intelligence had failed to notice the Japanese airfield construction on Guadalcanal until it was nearly complete. Yet Japanese intelligence was even worse. In July 1942, Tokyo remained focused on New Guinea, believing Australia and Port Moresby to be the next decisive fronts. Major General Tomitaro Horii's South Seas Force landed near Buna, building new airfields for another push against Port Moresby. Bombers and fighters hammered the city daily, convinced that the Allies were too weak for any counterstroke. Even Admiral Yamamoto, aboard his flagship Yamato in Japanese waters, was preoccupied with plans for operations against Australia. By early August, Japanese air units in La were pulled back to Rabaul to prepare for renewed offensives. Heavy clouds blanketed the South Pacific, and only a few Japanese reconnaissance planes flew. None spotted the vast American invasion armada. On August 6, Japanese pilots near Bin were startled to encounter carrier aircraft. They assumed these belonged to Australians. After all, they had been told U.S. carriers were destroyed at Midway. In truth, they were facing the lead elements of America's first counteroffensive. By August 7, the skies cleared. At dawn, the American fleet went to general quarters. At 6 o'clock, the carriers Wasp, Saratoga, and Enterprise launched their first strikes. Their targets, Guadalcanal, Tulagi, Gavutu, and Tanambogo. At Gavutu and Tanambogo, Japanese seaplanes sat vulnerable at their base. The element of surprise held. At 6:12 a.m. Japanese communications from Tulagi finally broke the silence with a terse, urgent transmission, enemy heavy bombardment in progress. The message raced to the 4th, 6th, and 8th fleets, to Yamamoto, and to Imperial headquarters. After months of unbroken victories, Japan was about to face its first great test, the Battle for Guadalcanal. From dawn until mid-morning, carrier patrols shielded the transports. Bombers struck Tulagi and Lunga Point without opposition. No Japanese planes appeared, the skies belonged entirely to the Americans. The only losses were to accidents, not combat. Other carrier squadrons swept over Gavutu, catching the Japanese completely by surprise. Seaplanes sat helpless in the water, and in minutes 9 Kawanishi flying boats and 8 additional floatplanes were destroyed. A few pilots tried to take off but were gunned down before their wheels left the surface. By the time the smoke cleared, not a single aircraft at Gavutu survived. Other strikes hammered troop positions on Tulagi and beach defenses where Marines would soon land. As night lifted, men crowded the decks of the transports and caught their first glimpse of Guadalcanal's looming mountains. The convoy slipped into Sealark Channel between Guadalcanal and Savo Island. At dawn, the escorting cruisers and destroyers opened fire. Shells arced into the shoreline, setting fuel dumps ablaze. Columns of fire climbed into the sky as the shoreline vanished beneath smoke and dust. At 8 o'clock, after 2 hours of bombardment, the first landing craft churned toward the beaches east of Lunga Point. For the Marines, this was uncharted territory, the first American amphibious invasion since the Spanish-American War. At 9 o'clock, the men splashed ashore. To their astonishment, there was no resistance. The Japanese had abandoned their camps and scattered into the hills. The Marines advanced cautiously through empty barracks and shattered tents. They found meals abandoned mid-bite, rice bowls half-filled, chopsticks left in haste, platters of meat and fruit untouched. It was proof of how sudden the American assault had been. The defenders had been construction troops, not infantry, and naval shelling had driven them off before the Marines arrived. But if anyone thought the invasion would be easy, they were quickly disabused. Across the channel at Tulagi, Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson's 1st Marine Raiders and the 5th Battalion, 2nd Marines, met far different resistance. Here, 250 seasoned Japanese troops of the Yokohama Air Group under Captain Shigetoshi Miyazaki held firm. Unlike the construction workers on Guadalcanal, these were trained combat veterans. Edson's raiders were elite themselves, chosen volunteers hardened by months of grueling training. Their concept had been inspired by Colonel Evans Carlson's time with Chinese guerrillas, who had fought the Japanese with ruthless efficiency. But even raiders with their reputation would be tested here. Landing at 8:15 a.m. Edson's men pushed through thick jungle choked with vines and thorny bougainvillea. Progress was agonizingly slow, it took 3 hours to hack a mile and a half to the central ridge. When they finally broke into the open, they found themselves beneath carefully prepared Japanese defenses. Machine guns covered every approach, fields of fire overlapped, and dugouts were reinforced with rock and timber. The Marines clawed uphill, tossing grenades and dynamite charges into bunkers. Even then, the defenders often fought on. In one case, 17 Japanese were killed by explosives, only for 2 survivors to ambush Marines retrieving equipment. Casualties mounted, one company suffered 15% losses in a single afternoon. Worse still were the snipers. Hidden in trees, buildings, and rocks, they let Marine units pass, then fired into their backs. The tactic was suicidal but deadly, and it sowed fear through every advance. By nightfall, Edson's raiders had bloodied the enemy, but they also knew this truth: the Japanese were no ordinary foe. Tulagi was the first true test, and the fight for the Solomons had only just begun. The Japanese rifle and machine gun fire was often designed to wound rather than kill, forcing the enemy to commit men and resources to evacuation and care. For the Marines, it meant an endless stream of casualties, even when advancing against light resistance. By afternoon, Edson's raiders pressed along the ridge until they reached a deep ravine, once a British cricket field. The Japanese had dug into the ravine walls, creating interlocking fields of fire. Moving further risked disaster. Edson wisely halted, darkness was no time to stumble into an ambush. That night, the Marines learned what Japanese counterattacks truly meant. At 10:30, the defenders struck, slipping through a gap between companies. They swarmed one unit, surrounding it in the dark. Fighting erupted in foxholes and hand-to-hand, rifles, knives, grenades, and bare fists. The Japanese surged toward Edson's command post, within 50 yards before being thrown back. One Marine company lost half its non-commissioned officers in the melee. At dawn on August 8, reinforcements landed, swelling American strength on Tulagi to 7,500. The Raiders and 5th Marines resumed their drive, focusing on the cricket field defenses. Cave by cave, dugout by dugout, they blasted positions with grenades and satchel charges. In one cavern, they found 35 dead, some already decomposed, others freshly killed. The lesson was unmistakable: Japanese defenders would fight to the last man unless ordered otherwise. More chilling still was their refusal to surrender. In one dugout, 3 officers with a single pistol ended their lives rather than give up. One shot his companions before turning the weapon on himself. For Americans, the discovery was jarring. Even when surrounded, wounded, or hopelessly outnumbered, Japanese soldiers chose death over capture. Marines quickly learned that offers of quarter were dangerous. Some Japanese feigned surrender only to attack with hidden grenades or knives. After that, few chances were given. Tulagi was declared secure on the second day, though snipers lingered for days, harassing Marines until the last was hunted down. The stubbornness of the fight was captured in the ordeal of Gunnery Sergeant Angus Goss. Ordered to silence a cave, he hurled grenades inside, only to have them tossed back out. Twice, he narrowly escaped his own explosions. Furious, he called for a satchel charge of dynamite. The Japanese pushed it out before it detonated, wounding him with flying rock. Enraged, Goss stormed the cave with his submachine gun, killing 4 defenders and finding 8 more dead within. If Tulagi was brutal, Gavutu and Tenambogo were worse. Landings there came mid-morning, with only light forces committed. No one expected heavy resistance. But the Japanese had fortified the seaplane bases on both islands. The 1st Marines ashore met scattered rifle fire, but by the time the second wave landed, defenders had regrouped. Fire raked the beaches. The third wave was hit even before reaching shore. Both islands rose in steep 150-foot hills, small in size, but high enough to dominate the landings. The Japanese, well supplied with machine guns and rifles, clung to every bunker and cave. As on Tulagi, no position was abandoned. Each had to be blasted out with grenades, explosives, or stormed in desperate close combat. On Tenambogo, the fighting grew savage. Early waves managed to land tanks at the dock, only to face a furious counterattack. The Japanese charged with rifles and grenades, hurling themselves at steel and fire. For the Marines, the reality was clear: this was only the beginning of Guadalcanal's long and merciless campaign. The fighting on Tenambogo turned vicious. Japanese troops swarmed the Marine tanks, jamming crowbars under treads, tossing grenades, and shoving flaming rags soaked in gasoline against the armor. One tank commander fired his machine gun through the hatch, cutting down 23 attackers before a soldier clambered up the hull and stabbed him to death with a bayonet. Moments later, gasoline-soaked rags were thrown inside, and the tank erupted in flames. By mid-afternoon it was clear the Marines needed help. Reinforcements were pulled from nearby Florida Island, which had been unoccupied. Ordered to secure the causeway linking Gavutu and Tenambogo, they launched their assault at dusk. 5 minutes of naval bombardment softened the shore, but a final shell struck a fuel dump, turning the beach into a fiery spotlight. As the Marines advanced silhouetted against the sea, Japanese machine guns and rifles opened up from hidden positions. 2 boatloads reached the shore, but the coxswain of the third was killed at his tiller, sending the craft veering back. Others followed, believing the attack had been cancelled, leaving the men stranded under relentless fire. Pinned down at the pier, the Marines fought desperately. Japanese troops counterattacked from the hillsides, and Captain Crane, cut off with a handful of men, was forced into the brush. They crawled through the darkness, slipping past enemy lines before finally rejoining their unit. Confusion reigned until the early hours of August 8, when more reinforcements landed and secured the causeway. By then, the battle had become a slaughter. Of the 500 Japanese defending Gavutu and Tanambogo, none survived. Word of the landing spread quickly. At dawn on August 7, Tulagi's radio station sent the first alarm to Rabaul. The news stunned Japanese airmen preparing their usual raids against New Guinea. Orders were cancelled, the enemy fleet had to be struck at once. Before the pilots even took off, more bad news arrived. Tulagi's seaplane base was silent, its aircraft destroyed, its transmissions cut. The island had fallen. At 8:30 a.m. 27, Betty twin-engine bombers roared into the skies, loaded not with torpedoes but with bombs meant for Australia. 180 Zero fighters flew escort. Climbing to 13,000 feet, they swept east over Bougainville, then turned south. Just after 1 o'clock, 4 Wildcat fighters from Enterprise spotted the formation above Florida Island. They dove in, Lieutenant V.P. Dietz shooting down 1 bomber and damaging several more before Zero fighters pounced. Outnumbered, the Wildcats dove into clouds as ordered, but not before losing a man. Dietz's aircraft, riddled with holes, limped back for an emergency landing on Wasp. Elsewhere, the story was the same. Small groups of Wildcats intercepted waves of bombers, scoring kills but paying a price. Lieutenant G.E. Firebaw's section ran into 10 Zeros. 3 of his planes were shot down, he and 2 others were lost, though coastwatchers rescued 1 pilot drifting off Santa Isabel. The Japanese pressed on. Bombers broke through, and by 2:30 in the afternoon they reached Guadalcanal. Coastwatchers had already sent warnings hours earlier. Paul Mason, a planter on Malab Hill, spotted the formation and signaled, 24 bombers inbound, over 2 hours away. The message sped from Pearl Harbor to the fleet. On board HMAS Canberra, the word was passed with typical calm, ship will be attacked at noon by 24 torpedo bombers. All hands will pipe to dinner at 11. And sure enough, right on schedule, the Japanese came. Over the north shore of Guadalcanal, they bore down on the invasion fleet, straight into the guns and fighters waiting for them. At noon, the skies above Guadalcanal erupted. The American carriers and the guns of the fleet were ready. For the first time in the South Pacific, the Japanese felt the sting of a coordinated counterattack. The incoming Betty bombers were torn apart, of 24, only 1 made it back. The destroyer Mugford suffered a bomb hit, but otherwise the fleet was untouched. Against the Zeros, however, it was another story. Among the 18 elite pilots assigned to the long-range strike was Petty Officer Saburo Sakai, Japan's top ace. The Wildcats from the American carriers went straight for the bombers, forcing the Zeros to defend. Then, turning on the American fighters, they pressed a brutal dogfight. Sakai was unsettled by U.S. tactics. The Wildcats struck with slashing dives, then broke away, refusing to engage in turning duels where the Zero excelled. It was frustrating but effective. Sakai himself shot down a Wildcat and an SBD dive bomber, while other Japanese pilots scored kills of their own. But then, mistaking a formation of SBDs for fighters, Sakai attacked head-on, only to be met by the concentrated fire of 4 rear gunners. His Zero was riddled with bullets, and Sakai was grievously wounded. Somehow, he managed to nurse his shattered aircraft back to Rabaul before collapsing in the cockpit. The day showed both sides what lay ahead. The Zero still outclassed the F-4F Wildcat in speed, climb, and maneuverability, but the Americans were learning fast. Their Wildcats, though slower, were rugged, and their pilots began to exploit the Zero's weaknesses, light armament and inability to absorb damage. The strategic picture was complex. The Americans had carriers close offshore, giving them local air cover. The Japanese had numbers and experience, but every sortie from Rabaul meant an exhausting 1,100-mile round trip. Commander Nakajima, leading the Zero squadrons, had wisely sent only his best on the first day. Soon, however, less experienced pilots would be thrown into the fray, and losses would mount. By nightfall of August 7, the invasion appeared secure. Admiral Turner had landed 11,000 Marines. Ammunition, rations, and fuel were piling high on the beaches. General Vandegrift worried his men couldn't absorb the supplies quickly enough, but with the carriers preparing to withdraw, he was relieved to see them still flowing in. Inland, Marines advanced unopposed toward the unfinished airfield. One captured prisoner admitted that only 600 Japanese combat troops remained on the island, with laborers scattered to the far side. The following morning, August 8, the fight intensified. Coast Watcher Jack Red, stationed at Buka Passage, reported 45 Japanese dive bombers inbound. The warning flashed across the Pacific, giving the fleet precious time to prepare. Carrier fighters intercepted, downing many of the attackers. Yet not all were stopped. A flaming bomber plunged into the transport George F. Elliott, setting her ablaze. Another torpedo struck the destroyer Jarvis, knocking her out of action. American carrier planes struck back hard, hammering Japanese positions along the Tenaru River and the airfield itself. Later, Wildcats caught enemy torpedo bombers skimming low over the sea. 3 American pilots shot down several attackers, breaking up the run before they reached the transports. By nightfall, Enterprise's Fighting 6 counted 6 pilots lost. The Japanese still held an edge in aircraft performance and combat experience, but U.S. aviators were quickly adapting. New tactics spread through the squadrons: stay in pairs, fly the thatch weave, and concentrate firepower. The Wildcat could take punishment the Zero could not. On the ground, the Marines fought bitter battles for Tulagi, Gavutu, and Tanambogo. Casualties were heavy, over 300 in 2 days, but the garrisons were annihilated. On Tulagi, out of 250 defenders, only 3 surrendered. On Gavutu and Tanambogo, 500 were wiped out to the last man. The contrast with Guadalcanal was striking. There, Marines pushed inland with minimal resistance, nearing the airfield by the morning of August 8. The stage was set for the first great clash of the campaign. By the afternoon of August 7, the Marines had reached the edge of the airfield they would soon christen Henderson Field, in honor of Major Lofton Henderson, a Marine aviator killed at Midway. On the surface, the campaign seemed almost too easy. Marines joked openly. "I wish those Japanese would come out and fight," one said, within earshot of war correspondent Richard Tregiscus. To the rank and file, the enemy seemed to melt into the jungle. But to the officers, it was unsettling. War was never this simple. At sea, things appeared equally calm. Japanese patrol craft, tenders, and a handful of transports had been destroyed in the opening hours by naval gunfire and carrier planes. Only in the skies did the enemy offer serious resistance. Yet, even here, the Americans paid a price. The Zero fighters had exacted a toll. 21 of Admiral Fletcher's 99 carrier planes were gone. By the standards of naval aviation, it was acceptable. For Fletcher, it was confirmation of his fear: the carriers were too exposed. At 6 p.m. without waiting for approval, he signaled his intention to withdraw. Admiral Turner, upon intercepting the message, was stunned. The Marines ashore would soon be left without air cover, just as Japanese reinforcements were being marshaled to the north. When word of the invasion first reached Rabaul, Vice Admiral Genichi Mikawa, commander of the Japanese 8th Fleet, moved with speed. His initial plan was reinforcement. 6 transports were loaded with troops and sent south with destroyer escort. But fortune turned against them. The submarine S-38, patrolling out of Australia, intercepted the convoy and sank the Meo Maru, drowning more than 300 soldiers. With news of the massive American fleet off Guadalcanal, Mikawa ordered the remaining transports back. The real response would come from the sea. That same morning, 5 heavy cruisers had departed cavying at the northern tip of New Ireland. 3 steamed toward Manus, 2 for Rabaul. Mikawa quickly redirected them all south. By late afternoon, his flagship Chokai, accompanied by destroyer escort, entered Simpson Harbor. Soon she was joined by light cruisers Tenryu and Yubari. By nightfall, Mikawa commanded a formidable squadron: 5 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and a destroyer, now racing south toward Guadalcanal. His plan was bold: delay his approach until after midnight, then strike with a surprise night attack. Mikawa knew the Americans had carriers, but he also knew their weakness. The U.S. Navy had little experience with night fighting, the Imperial Navy excelled at it. If he struck swiftly, the enemy could be annihilated at anchor. Unwittingly, the Americans played into his hands. Intelligence failures left them blind to his approach. Reports trickled in. Army B-17s had spotted Japanese ships near Rabaul, the submarine S-38 had sighted cruisers in St. George's Channel, but neither was treated as urgent. After all, Rabaul was a busy naval hub, movements in and out were routine. Admiral Turner had studied his charts and saw the danger. The Japanese had a perfect avenue of approach down the length of New Georgia Sound, later infamous as the Slot. He requested a concentrated air search. But somewhere between his flagship, Admiral McCain's headquarters, and the seaplane tender Mackinac, the order vanished. On August 8, the most obvious approach route, the Slot itself, was left completely uncovered. As night fell, Mikawa's cruisers pressed southward, unseen and undetected, toward the unsuspecting Allied fleet.